The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, defines trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in a variety of ways, either by directly experiencing it, witnessing it happening to another person, not on TV or in the movies, learning the events happened to a close family member or friend, or being exposed to repeated exposure to details of an event, such as a first responder collecting evidence. This definition is concrete, precise, and direct. It is easy to apply and identify those who meet the criteria for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The criteria for this disorder actually contains 8 sections, and most of them have between 4 and 6 subcriteria. The problem is we can often observe the criteria and subcriteria in individuals who have not been exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. There has not been a whole lot of research done into what makes an experience traumatic, but there has been a lot of research into the individual differences of people who experience an event and either don't exhibit symptoms of PTSD. This has helped us identify protective factors against PTSD. Some of these factors are having an adaptive coping style, being resilient, social supports, and being optimistic. That is why, for our purposes, we will look at more of the elements that, given the protective factors, will likely lead to increased stress and create the experience of trauma, something we can refer to as the trauma triangle. The trauma triangle focuses on the experience of the individual and how they may feel about a situation or event, rather than exacting and concrete definition of an event. This model of trauma takes into account individual differences of the perception of danger and states that a traumatic experience is one where 3 elements are observed by the individual experiencing the event. They are no value or meaning, indicating the situation or experience bears no meaning or purpose for the person experiencing it. No choice or escape. The situation or experience feels forced to the person experiencing it. They cannot identify an element of choice or of escape. And no expression. The individual thinks or feels that in order to survive, they cannot speak their mind and or emotions, and the physical manifestations associated with the emotions need to be suppressed. Let's get into each one of these with a little bit more detail. Imagine you're walking into a store and somebody rushing out of the store pushes you aside, causing you to fall to the ground. You have no idea why this person pushed you. There is no one else around, no one is chasing after this person, and they are not moving towards anyone in particular. You may ask yourself the situation, why did this happen to me? As you dust yourself off and find your way into the store. This particular situation has no value or meaning to you because you cannot place it into any type of a context. It happened in isolation. You are alone and the event just happens with no warning or consequence other than your dusty bottom. When a situation has no value or meaning, we do not understand why the event is taking place. If we do understand why it's happening, the reason for the event has no personal meaning. In these situations, we can feel invisible, and feeling invisible can prompt feelings of loneliness or disconnection. Social support and or connection to others is a protective factor against trauma because we can place it within the context of our connections to others. Faith in a higher power or universal intelligence can also help, but because we can place the event within the context of learning about ourselves or the will of the higher power / universal intelligence. However, if the event does not align with our culture or community, the event will create feelings of disconnection. Take, for instance, a story in the book Loving Kindness by Sharon Salzberg. In the final chapter of the book, Living Our Love, Salzberg discusses the lack of trauma symptoms identified in the DSM or the Tibetan people tortured by the Chinese. In the story, the lack of trauma symptoms is attributed to the concept of karma. The people who are tortured do not view their torture as something painful happening to them. They focus on the compassion for those administering the torture and the emotional pain it likely takes for someone to administer such pain on another person. In this context, karma is viewed as part of the universal connectedness between all living creatures. That connectedness creates a protective factor against the symptoms of PTSD. Remember also, the first level of the stress response system is the social engagement system. And within this context, the social engagement system can be our social connectedness system. If we feel connected while experiencing a stressful event, we do not move into the second level of the stress of the system, which creates the other two factors: no choice or escape and no expression. Have you ever experienced something where you did not think you had a choice to experience it or could not think of a way to get out of it, but later on you could see an escape or a way out? Well, when we feel we do not have a choice whether we can escape an experience, this automatically evokes fear and kicks off the stress response system. The second level of the stress response system includes shaking, sweating, nausea, dry mouth, faster breathing, heart palpitations, and dizziness. Our heightened fear prompts the inability to observe safety or an exit from the situation. Therefore, even if someone outside the situation can identify a safe escape, but the person experiencing the event cannot, there is still a lack of choice or escape. Take, for instance, the idea of a violent attack and a story of a young woman regarding being abducted, raped, and tortured. The woman was driving on a back street in an area that can be a little dicey. She stopped at a stop sign, windows open and doors unlocked. A man approached her and got in the car. Now, we might look at this situation and say there are several things that she could have done to avoid the man getting into the car, and other things she could have done after he got into the car. Unfortunately, she was unable to see yelling for help or trying to get away as an option, even when reviewing the situation in hindsight. Here's another example that might bring this one home. A child is sitting in the kitchen doing her homework with her older sibling while mom makes dinner, and they listen to the traffic report. They were waiting for dad to come home from work. He had a long commute and a stressful job. If the traffic is bad, he'll typically come home angry, and as mom waits for him to pull into the driveway, she becomes more and more scared. The children know this and are also become increasingly frightened of the man who will soon step into the room. Dinner is always quiet except for dad, who yells and complains about his day and his commute. The tension would cause the little girl to become nervous, often shaking as she tried to eat. It would cause her stomach to tighten and make it difficult for her to eat. This aggravated her father, who would point out that she was not eating the dinner that her mother worked so hard to prepare for the family. Shaking, she would try to help the family clean up from dinner, but the shaking would become so bad that she sometimes dropped things and made a mess. This would infuriate her already angry father, who would launch into a tirade. Now, in this situation, the child's life is not necessarily in danger, nor is there a threat of physical danger, but the child perceives no escape from the situation. She feels trapped to face the daily anger and tension in the house, and often feels very alone despite the fact that her family is all experiencing the same thing. That little girl in the previous example likely does not feel safe enough to express to anyone in her family, least of all her father, how his anger affects her. She feels the tension of her home twofold. First, she's trying to suppress her reaction to the tension, the shaking, and the inability to eat, try and make her father happy. Second, she believes she cannot control the situation and knows if she tries to verbally express her discomfort to her family, she will face even more dire consequences, further lack of connectedness to her family members, and possible retribution. The term no expression can either mean that we feel we must suppress how we feel or are reacting, or we do not know how to express how we feel, such as in the cases of alexithymia. Because the stress response has initiated adrenaline into the system, the body reacts automatically, and the mind cannot necessarily control our actions. This natural automatic process can be interpreted as the body failing the mind. In the case of alexithymia, Individuals do not have the capacity to express how they feel and are therefore unable to release the feelings associated with the traumatic experience. This inability to express verbally what is happening and the body launching into automatic processes without the control of our thinking mind is part of the reason rape tends to be a difficult crime to prosecute and why so many women choose not to pursue it. Due to the activation of the stress response system's second level, women often cannot say no or stop or yell for help. It creates an out-of-body experience where the body just reacts without the control of the mind. Often women will climax during the rape event, and many believe that if a person climaxes during a rape event, it means they enjoy what was happening. While this is not true, many rape survivors do not necessarily understand their body is just reacting to adrenaline and stimulation, creating feelings of guilt and shame. The idea of a triangle comes from when these three elements, lack of meaning, lack of choice, and lack of expression, are present and overlap during a traumatic experience. The more present each of these elements are, indicated by their relative size. The greater the presence of the element, the larger the bubble. The smaller the presence, the smaller the bubble. If they are all large, then they will overlap, evoking increased stress and the presentation of PTSD symptoms.